After years of being treated poorly by her stepchildren, a widow discovers her late husband secretly left her everything. Her stepchildren were shocked. The desk drawer slid open with a whisper, revealing the cream-colored envelope marked "For Vivian's eyes only," in handwriting I recognized but hadn't seen in 3 months, not since the funeral. My trembling fingers traced the familiar script as 23-year-old Caleb's voice echoed from the hallway. "She better not think she's keeping any of Dad's money." The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11, its brass pendulum catching the morning light that streamed through the bay windows of what had been Richard's study. Everything in this room still smelled like his cologne, cedar and bergamot, a scent that had once made me feel safe, but now seemed to mock my precarious position in this house. I'd been avoiding this space for weeks, unable to face the memories that lived in every leather-bound book and polished surface. But today was different. Today, the lawyer's call had changed everything. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mr. Garrison had said in his measured tone, "there are additional documents we need to discuss. Private documents. Can you come to the office this afternoon?" The way he'd emphasized private sent shivers down my spine. After 6 years of marriage to Richard, I thought I knew all his secrets. The way he took his coffee black but added sugar when he thought no one was looking. How he'd wake up at midnight sometimes, staring at the ceiling with tears in his eyes, whispering apologies to his first wife, Catherine. The guilt that ate at him for finding love again after losing her to cancer 12 years ago. What I didn't know was what he'd hidden in that sealed envelope the lawyer now insisted I had to see before anyone else. The house creaked around me, its 100-year-old bones settling into another day of barely contained hostility. Upstairs, I could hear 19-year-old Piper moving around her room, probably packing more of her belongings to take back to college. Anything to avoid spending another minute under the same roof as me. The twins, Caleb and his sister Zoe, had made their feelings crystal clear since the moment they'd returned from their semester abroad 2 weeks after Richard's sudden heart attack. "You're not our mother," Zoe had spat at me during the reception following the funeral, her emerald eyes, so much like Richard's, blazing with grief and rage. "You never will be." I'd married their father when Caleb and Zoe were 17 and Piper was 13. 6 years of trying to build bridges, 6 years of small kindnesses rejected, 6 years of being treated like an intruder in what they considered their ancestral home. The Victorian mansion on Elm Street had belonged to the Hartwell family for 3 generations, and I was just the outsider who'd somehow convinced their grieving father to marry again. But something in Mr. Garrison's voice suggested that Richard had seen things differently. The envelope felt heavier than it should have as I lifted it from the drawer. Inside, I could feel the bulk of what seemed like multiple documents, and my heart hammered against my ribs as I wondered what Richard could have possibly kept from me. Our marriage had been built on honesty, or so I'd believed. We talked about everything, his fears about being a good father to teenagers while grieving his first wife, my own insecurities about stepping into Catherine's shadow, the way we'd found unexpected love in the rubble of our respective broken hearts. Richard had been my salvation after my first marriage had ended in spectacular betrayal. My ex-husband's affair with my own sister had left me questioning everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty. Richard had shown me that some men actually meant their vows, that some promises could be trusted. Now, holding this mysterious envelope, I wondered if I'd been naive all over again. "Mom," the voice made me jump, and I quickly slipped the envelope into my purse. Piper stood in the doorway, her auburn hair, the same shade as her mother's in the family photos, falling across her shoulders. She rarely called me Mom anymore, not since Richard died, and the word now carried an edge of uncertainty. "What are you doing in here?" she asked, stepping into the study with careful, measured steps. Everything about Piper had become measured since the funeral, as if she were afraid that any sudden movement might shatter what was left of her world. "I was just looking for something your father mentioned." The lie came easily, though it left a bitter taste in my mouth. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" She shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both teenage indifference and profound loss. "Caleb and Zoe are talking about the will reading again. They think you're going to try to take everything." The accusation hung in the air between us like smoke. I wanted to tell her that I'd never wanted Richard's money, that I'd signed a prenuptial agreement specifically to avoid this kind of suspicion. But the words wouldn't come, partly because I wasn't sure Piper would believe them, and partly because something about that envelope made me question what I thought I knew about Richard's final wishes. "Piper," I said carefully, "do you really believe I married your father for his money?" For a moment, her facade cracked, and I saw the vulnerable girl who used to come to me with scraped knees and bad dreams. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. "Everything feels different now. Like I don't even know who Dad really was." Her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the old windows. What did she mean? What had she discovered, or thought she discovered, about Richard? Before I could ask, the front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, followed by the sound of Caleb's voice raised in anger. "I don't care what that lawyer says. She's not getting Dad's business. She didn't build it from nothing like he did." Zoe's voice joined his, slightly calmer but no less determined. "We need to contest whatever's in that will. There has to be a way." Piper's eyes widened, and she looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You should probably go," she said quietly. "They're really upset." But I was tired of running from their anger, tired of tiptoeing around their grief, while drowning in my own. Richard had been my husband, my partner, my best friend. I'd earned the right to mourn him without constantly defending my place in his life. "No," I said, straightening my shoulders. "This is my home, too." The words had barely left my mouth when Caleb appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with emotion and what looked suspiciously like alcohol despite the early hour. Behind him, Zoe's expression was carved from ice, beautiful and merciless. "You're home." Caleb laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've been here 6 years. We've been here our entire lives. Your father chose to share his life with me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He chose to make me part of this family." "He was lonely and grieving," Zoe said, stepping around her brother to face me directly. "You took advantage of that." The accusation hit like a physical blow, partly because I'd wondered the same thing during those early months of our relationship. Richard had been so lost when we met at a charity gala 2 years after Catherine's death, so clearly adrift despite his successful exterior. I'd been recently divorced, still reeling from my own betrayal, and maybe we had clung to each other out of mutual need rather than genuine love. But what we'd built together had been real. I'd felt it in the way he'd reach for my hand during movies, in the way he'd make my coffee exactly how I liked it without being asked, in the way he defended me to his children even when it cost him their approval. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Caleb pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. "Actually, we know more than you think. Zoe's been doing some research." The twins exchanged a look that made my stomach clench with dread. What kind of research? What could they have possibly found? "Show her," Caleb said, and Zoe held up her own phone. On the screen was a photograph I recognized with horrible clarity, me and Richard at dinner 3 months before Catherine's death, both of us laughing at something he'd said. It had been a business dinner, nothing more, though I remembered being struck by how different he seemed from the other venture capitalists I'd met through my marketing firm. Warmer, more genuine, less concerned with impressing people than with actually connecting with them. "This was taken at Giuseppe's," Zoe said, her voice deadly quiet. 3 months before Mom died. "You want to explain why you were having romantic dinners with a married man?" The room spun around me as the implications sank in. They thought Richard and I had been having an affair before Catherine died. They thought I was the reason their parents' marriage had ended, that I'd somehow caused their mother's death by stealing their father's attention when she needed him most. "It wasn't," I started, but Caleb cut me off. "Save it. We know what we know. And now we know why Dad married you so fast after the funeral. Guilt." The word hit me like a slap, and I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Because part of me had always wondered if that were true, if Richard's proposal 18 months after Catherine's death had been motivated more by obligation than love. "That's not what happened," I said, but my voice was barely a whisper. Then what did happen? Piper asked, and I realized she'd been listening to every word. Her face was pale, her eyes huge with confusion and hurt.
Mom, please.
I need to understand. The use of mom again nearly broke me. Despite everything, Piper still saw me as family, still needed me to make sense of the chaos her life had become. But how could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? The envelope in my purse seemed to pulse with hidden secrets, and I found myself wondering if Richard's final message would damn me or save me. The will reading is at 2 o'clock, I said instead of answering. Maybe we'll all understand better after that. Caleb snorted. Oh, we'll understand plenty. We'll understand exactly how much our father was willing to sacrifice for his guilty conscience. But as I left the study, passing the family photos that lined the hallway, images of Catherine's warm smile, of family vacations I'd never been part of a life that had existed before I'd ever entered the picture, I couldn't shake the feeling that none of us understood anything at all. The drive to Mr. Garrison's office passed in a blur of autumn colors and racing thoughts. The envelope sat beside me on the passenger seat, and twice I'd started to pull over and read it, only to lose my nerve. Whatever Richard had written, whatever truths or confessions it contained, would change everything. Some secrets were meant to stay buried, some truths too painful to bear. But as I sat in the parking lot outside the law office, I knew I couldn't face Richard's children without knowing what their father had really wanted them to understand. My hands shook as I opened the envelope, and the first thing I saw was Richard's handwriting on a note clipped to a thick stack of documents. My darling Vivian, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and my children are probably blaming you for everything that went wrong. Please read everything before you make your decision about what to do next. They deserve to know the truth, but I was too much of a coward to tell them while I was alive. I'm counting on your strength to finish what I couldn't. All my love, Richard. My hands trembling, I unfolded the first document, a medical report dated 6 months before Catherine's death. The diagnosis hit me like a physical blow: early onset Alzheimer's disease, aggressive progression expected, prognosis grim. Catherine had been dying long before I'd ever met Richard. The second document was a letter in Catherine's handwriting, addressed to her husband. My dearest Richard, I know you blame yourself for what's happening to me, but you must stop. This disease is stealing my mind, but it hasn't stolen my heart. I see how you look at me now like I'm already gone, and it breaks what's left of me. I want you to promise me something. When I'm gone, really gone, don't spend the rest of your life in this mausoleum of grief. Find someone who makes you laugh again. Find someone who reminds you that you're alive. The children will understand eventually, but they're going to need time to grieve. Please don't let them hate whoever helps you heal. I love you. I love them. Make sure they know that everything I did was to protect them from watching me disappear. Catherine. My vision blurred as I realized what I was reading. Catherine had hidden her diagnosis from her children, had endured the early stages of Alzheimer's alone except for Richard's support. The family photos I'd seen, the ones from her final year, took on new meaning as I remembered the forced smiles, the way she'd seemed to be trying too hard to appear normal. And that dinner at Giuseppe's, Richard had been meeting with me about a marketing campaign for a charity supporting Alzheimer's research. He'd been trying to find ways to help other families avoid the hell his own was living through. The third document was a copy of Catherine's actual will, dated just weeks before her death. In it, she specifically mentioned me by name. To Vivian Torres, who has become dear to our family through her work with the Alzheimer's Foundation, I leave my grandmother's pearl necklace and my deepest gratitude for helping my husband find hope again in the darkest time of our lives. I sat in that parking lot, surrounded by the truth Richard had been too afraid to share, and wept for all of us, for Catherine, who died protecting her children from a truth she thought would destroy them, for Richard, who'd carried the weight of her secrets even in his new marriage, for Caleb, Zoe, and Piper, who'd created their own version of events to make sense of their loss, and for myself, who'd spent 6 years doubting the authenticity of the love I'd found. But the envelope wasn't empty yet. The final document was the most devastating of all, a a series of photographs and medical records showing that Catherine's Alzheimer's had progressed much faster than anyone had anticipated. In her final months, she'd become violent and unpredictable, requiring round-the-clock care that Richard had provided himself rather than burden the children with the truth about their mother's condition. The last photo showed Richard with scratches on his face and arms, a haunted look in his eyes that I now recognized as the expression he'd worn during our early dates when he'd seemed to disappear into himself. A handwritten note from Richard was clipped to the back. Catherine made me promise to let the children remember her as she was before the disease took her. I honored that promise, but it meant I had to become the villain in their story. They think I abandoned her in her final months, that I was already moving on with you while she was dying alone. The truth is that I was with her every moment until the end, and you are the only person who gave me the strength to survive watching the woman I'd loved for 20 years forget my name, forget our children's names, forget everything we'd built together. You saved my life, Vivian. I just pray that someday my children will understand that loving you didn't mean I loved their mother any less. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headrest, finally understanding the full scope of what Richard had carried alone. No wonder he'd woken up some nights whispering apologies to Catherine. He'd been apologizing not for betraying her, but for surviving when she couldn't, for finding happiness again when she'd wanted him to. The clock on my dashboard showed 1:45. In 15 minutes, I'd be sitting across from Richard's children, listening to his will being read, watching them learn that their father had left them comfortable trust funds but had given me the bulk of his estate, including the family home and his business. What they didn't know was that Richard had also left me a choice. The final page of his letter was addressed to me alone. Vivian, I've left you everything because I know you're the only one strong enough to decide what's right for our family. You can keep what I've given you, and no one could blame you for it. Or you can use these documents to help my children understand the truth about their mother's death and our marriage, and then you can give them back what was always meant to be theirs. I couldn't make this decision while I was alive, because I was too afraid of hurting them more than they'd already been hurt. But you have the courage I never had. Whatever you choose, know that you gave me 6 years of happiness I never thought I'd feel again. That's worth more than any inheritance. All my love, Richard. As I walked into the law office, the envelope tucked securely in my purse, I realized that Richard's final gift to me wasn't money or property. It was the chance to finally bridge the gap between his past and our present, to help his children understand that love wasn't a finite resource, that honoring their mother's memory didn't require hating me. But first, I had to sit through the reading of a will that would make them hate me even more. Mr. Garrison's office was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer who'd been practicing for 40 years. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound law books, and the kind of heavy silence that suggested important decisions were made within these walls. Caleb, Zoe, and Piper were already seated when I arrived, their faces carefully composed, but their body language screaming tension. Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Garrison said, gesturing to the empty chair beside his desk. Thank you for coming. The formal use of my married name seemed to irritate the twins, though Piper's expression remained carefully neutral. I took my seat, hyper-aware of the envelope in my purse and the power it gave me to change everything they thought they knew about their family. Before we begin, Mr. Garrison said, adjusting his glasses, I want to make something clear. Your father's will is unusual. He's included several sealed sections that are to be opened only under specific circumstances, and he's given Mrs. Hartwell discretionary power over certain assets. Caleb's jaw tightened. What kind of discretionary power? We'll get to that, the lawyer said diplomatically. Let's start with the straightforward bequests. He read through a list of personal items, Richard's watch to Caleb, Catherine's jewelry to the girls, various family heirlooms distributed among the children. Then came the trust funds, generous amounts that would ensure all 3 children could live comfortably without ever working if they chose not to. And now, Mr. Garrison said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, we come to the primary estate. I held my breath. To my beloved wife Vivian, I leave the family home on Elm Street, my shares in Hartwell Investments and all remaining assets, with the following stipulation. She is to use her discretion in determining how these assets are ultimately distributed among my children, taking into consideration their individual needs and circumstances as they mature. The silence that followed was deafening. What does that mean exactly? Zoe asked, her voice barely controlled. Mr. Garrison looked at me before answering. It means that Mrs. Hartwell has the legal right to keep everything, or to distribute it as she sees fit. Your father essentially made her the executor of his true wishes for the estate. That's insane, Caleb exploded, jumping to his feet. She's not even our real family. She's a gold digger who seduced a grieving widower, and now she gets to decide our future. Caleb, Piper said quietly, but he was beyond listening.
No.
I'm not going to sit here and pretend this is okay. Dad was clearly not in his right mind when he wrote this will. We need to contest it. There's more, Mr. Garrison said, his voice cutting through Caleb's tirade. Your father anticipated this reaction. There's a sealed letter to be opened only if the will is contested. He pulled out another envelope, this one marked with Richard's law firm seal. He was very specific about the circumstances under which this should be read. Zoe and Caleb exchanged glances, and I could see them calculating whether their anger was worth whatever bombshell their father might have left behind. Open it, Zoe said finally. Mr. Garrison broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. His expression grew increasingly grave as he read silently. What does it say? Caleb demanded. The lawyer looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. It says, if my children are contesting this will, then they have refused to trust my judgment even in death. In that case, Vivian is to keep everything, and they are to receive only the trust funds already specified. However, if they choose to honor my wishes and trust Vivian's discretion, she has been given documents that will help them understand why I made these decisions. The choice is theirs. The room fell silent again, and I could feel 3 pairs of eyes boring into me. They were trapped, and they knew it. Contest the will and lose everything, or trust the stepmother they'd spent 6 years resenting. What documents? Piper asked quietly. I pulled the envelope from my purse, my hand steadier now that the moment had finally arrived. Letters from your father. And from your mother. The change in their expressions was immediate and dramatic. Zoe went completely pale, while Caleb's anger transformed into something that looked like fear. Mom left letters? Piper whispered. She left 1 letter, I said carefully. But there are other documents. Medical records. Photos. Things your father thought you should know about your mother's final months. What kind of medical records? Zoe asked, and I heard the dread in her voice. This was the moment. I could destroy their misconceptions about their mother's death, force them to confront the painful truth about Catherine's illness, make them understand that their father had been a hero, not a villain. Or I could find another way, a gentler path that honored both Richard's wishes and their need to grieve. Your mother was sick, I said finally. Much sicker than any of you knew. Your father spent her final months caring for her, trying to protect you from seeing how bad it had gotten. What do you mean, sick? Caleb's voice had lost its anger, replaced by something much more vulnerable. She had early-onset Alzheimer's disease, I said, the words falling into the silence like stones. Aggressive progression. She hid it from you because she wanted you to remember her as she was, not as the disease made her. Piper began to cry, quiet tears that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Zoe stared at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes, while Caleb sank back into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. That's impossible, Zoe said. She was fine. She was herself, right up until. She was acting, I said gently.
For you.
Because she loved you enough to endure the terror of losing her mind alone rather than watch you suffer through it with her. I pulled out Catherine's letter and handed it to Zoe. She wrote this to your father. She wanted him to find happiness again after she was gone. She specifically asked him not to let you hate whoever helped him heal. Zoe's hands shook as she unfolded the letter, and I watched her face crumble as she read her mother's final words. She passed it to Caleb without speaking, and he read it with tears streaming down his face. She knew about you, Piper said, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. She approved of Dad marrying you. More than that, I said, pulling out the copy of Catherine's will. She left me her grandmother's pearls. She considered me family before she died. The silence stretched on as they processed this information, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting to see how they would react to having their entire narrative about our family rewritten. I don't understand, Caleb said finally. If Mom was that sick, why didn't Dad tell us? Why did we have to find out like this? Because he made her a promise, I said. And because he was afraid you'd blame yourselves for not seeing the signs, for being away at school, for being normal teenagers when your mother needed you most. But we did blame ourselves, Zoe said, her voice breaking. We blamed ourselves for not being there enough, for not being better daughters, for not making Dad happy enough to stay faithful to Mom's memory. The pain in her voice nearly broke my heart. These children had been carrying guilt that wasn't theirs to bear, creating stories to explain their father's behavior that made them the villains in their own family's tragedy. Your father never stopped loving your mother, I said. Even after he married me, he would wake up some nights apologizing to her. Not for betraying her, but for surviving when she couldn't. For finding joy again when she'd wanted him to, but when he felt guilty for accepting it. Piper stood up suddenly and walked to the window, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All this time, we thought he'd abandoned her. We thought he'd chosen you over her. He chose healing over grief, I said. The way she wanted him to. The way she asked him to in that letter. Mr. Garrison had been sitting quietly through this exchange, but now he cleared his throat. There's one more document, he said, looking at me. Your father left specific instructions about this as well. He handed me a final sealed envelope, this one marked, to be opened only after the truth is revealed. Inside was a deed, not to the house on Elm Street, but to a piece of property I'd never heard of. With it was a note in Richard's handwriting. Vivian, this is a plot of land I purchased shortly after Catherine's diagnosis. I intended to build a care facility for Alzheimer's patients and their families, a place where people like us could find support and understanding. I never had the courage to move forward with the project, but I think you do. If my children choose to trust you with their inheritance, perhaps you can help them build something beautiful from the ashes of our grief. The plans are in my study in the locked drawer you never asked about. The foundation is already established, the Catherine Hartwell Memorial Foundation for Alzheimer's Research and Support. It just needs a family to make it real. I looked up to find 3 pairs of eyes watching me, and I realized that this was Richard's final test, not just of me, but of his children's capacity for forgiveness and growth. Your father wanted to build something, I said, holding up the deed. An Alzheimer's care facility. He started the planning after your mother's diagnosis, but he never finished it. He left it for us to finish together. Us. Caleb asked. All of us. As a family. If you want to. The silence that followed was different from the others, not heavy with anger or grief, but pregnant with possibility. What about the house?
Zoe asked.
What about Dad's business? I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would determine the course of all our lives. The house belongs to all of us. It always has. Your father put it in my name because he knew I'd never sell it or shut you out of it. As for the business, I smiled through my own tears. I know nothing about venture capitalism, but I know about marketing and public relations. If you want to learn to run your father's company, I'll help you. If you want to sell it and use the money for something else, that's your choice. Your father left me the power to decide, but he expected me to make the right decision for his children. And the right decision is? Piper asked, turning away from the window. The right decision is that you're adults now, and you get to choose your own futures. But I hope you'll choose to let me be part of them. Not as your mother. You had a mother, and she loved you beyond measure, but as someone who loved your father, and who's learned to love you too, even when you made it incredibly difficult. Caleb laughed despite his tears. We were pretty awful to you. You were grieving, I said. And you were protecting your mother's memory, the only way you knew how. I can respect that. But you stayed, Piper said. Even when we hated you, you stayed. I made a promise to your father, I said. And to your mother, in a way. I promised to help heal this family. I'm not giving up on that promise just because it's harder than I expected. Zoe stood up and walked over to me, her eyes still red from crying, but clearer than I'd seen them in months. I owe you an apology, she said. We all do. We've been horrible to you, and you didn't deserve it. You don't owe me anything, I said. You were protecting what you thought was right. But we were wrong, Caleb said, joining his sister. About everything. About you, about Dad, about Mom. You weren't wrong about loving your parents, I said. That's the only thing that really matters. Piper came over then, and suddenly I found myself surrounded by Richard's children, not as their adversary, but as someone they were finally ready to accept as family. So, what happens now?
Piper asked.
I looked around at their faces, seeing Richard's features reflected in each of them, and felt a surge of love so strong it nearly knocked me over. These were his children, his legacy, and they were finally ready to let me help them honor both their parents' memory. Now we go home, I said. And we figure out how to build something beautiful together. As we left Mr. Garrison's office, walking out into the crisp October afternoon as a family for the first time since Richard's death, I thought about the envelope that had started it all. Richard's final gift hadn't been money or property. It had been the truth, and the courage to share it when sharing it mattered most. But there was still one secret I hadn't shared, one final revelation that would change everything once again. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table in the house on Elm Street, the first family dinner we'd shared since the funeral, Piper asked the question I'd been dreading. Vivian, she said, using my name instead of Mom for the first time in a way that felt like acceptance rather than rejection. What made you fall in love with Dad? I mean, really fall in love, not just appreciate his kindness or his stability. What made you know he was the one? I set down my fork, knowing that my answer would either cement the trust we'd begun building or shatter it completely. I fell in love with him, I said slowly, the night he told me about your mother's diagnosis. We'd been dating for 6 months, and I knew something was haunting him, but he'd never said what. That night, he broke down and told me everything about the doctor visits, about watching her forget things, about making the decision to hide it from you kids because she'd asked him to. I looked around the table at their faces, seeing confusion beginning to replace acceptance. But Mom died 8 months after you and Dad started dating, Zoe said carefully. You just said he told you about her diagnosis after 6 months. My heart stopped as I realized what I'd just revealed. In my desire to be honest, I'd accidentally exposed the timeline that would make everything make sense and make everything worse. Vivian, Caleb said, his voice very quiet, how long had you and Dad been dating when Mom died? The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of truth that couldn't be taken back. 2 months, I whispered. 2 months, Zoe repeated, her voice flat. So, when that photo was taken at Giuseppe's. We've been on 3 dates, I finished. All of them related to the charity work. Nothing romantic had happened between us before your mother died. Nothing. But you were already falling for him, Piper said, and it wasn't a question. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I was. And I hated myself for it, because I knew he was married, I knew his wife was dying, and I knew it was wrong to feel anything for him while she was still alive. The family dinner I'd dreamed of was disintegrating before my eyes, and I could see the walls going back up around their hearts. But you stayed away until after the funeral, Caleb said. You didn't pursue him while Mom was dying. No, I said. I disappeared completely. I couldn't trust myself around him, and I couldn't bear the thought of being the reason he wasn't fully present for your mother's final weeks. Then how did you end up together?
Zoe asked. He found me, I said.
6 months after the funeral. He said he'd been looking for me since your mother died, that Catherine had asked him on her deathbed to make sure I knew how grateful she was for the work I'd done with the foundation. I pulled out one more document from the seemingly endless supply Richard had left me, a letter in Catherine's handwriting, addressed to me. She wrote this 3 days before she died, I said, handing it to Piper. Your father gave it to me the night he proposed. Piper unfolded the letter with shaking hands and read aloud. Dear Vivian, Richard has told me about your friendship, and I want you to know how grateful I am that he's found someone who makes him smile again. I know you stepped away when you learned about my illness, and that tells me everything I need to know about your character. When I'm gone, really gone, I hope you'll find your way back to each other. He's going to need someone who understands that loving again doesn't mean forgetting what came before. I think you might be that someone. Thank you for giving my husband hope during the darkest time of our lives. With love and gratitude, Catherine. The room was silent except for the sound of Piper crying and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. She knew, Zoe said finally. Mom knew Dad was falling in love with you, and she was okay with it. More than okay, I said. She encouraged it. But that doesn't make it less complicated or less painful for all of you. I understand if this changes things. Caleb leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that it made my chest ache. I don't know how to feel about any of this, he said. Part of me is angry that you and Dad had feelings for each other while Mom was still alive, even if you didn't act on them. But part of me is grateful that Mom wasn't alone in knowing Dad would be okay after she was gone. I feel like I'm betraying her by accepting this, Zoe said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I also feel like I'd be betraying her by rejecting the woman she specifically chose for Dad. Piper folded Catherine's letter carefully and handed it back to me. Can I ask you something? I nodded, bracing myself for whatever came next. Do you ever wish you'd met Dad first? Before Mom got sick, before everything got so complicated? The question pierced straight through me, touching on thoughts I never dared voice aloud. Every day, I admitted. But then I realized that if I had met him first, I wouldn't have fallen in love with the man he became through loving and losing your mother. His grief made him deeper, more compassionate, more grateful for small moments of joy. The Richard I fell in love with was shaped by 20 years of marriage to Catherine, by watching her fight that disease, by honoring her wishes even when it cost him his children's understanding. So you loved Mom too in a way, Piper said. I loved what she gave him, I said. I loved the man she helped him become. I loved her courage in choosing his happiness over her own jealousy. I loved her enough to spend 6 years trying to earn the trust of the children she asked me to help protect. The grandfather clock chimed 9, and I realized we'd been sitting at this table for over 2 hours, working through years of misunderstanding and hurt. There's something else, I said, knowing I couldn't hold back any more secrets. Your father left one final surprise. Something he never told anyone, not even me, until I found his papers today. I went to Richard's study and returned with a thick folder I'd discovered hidden behind the family photos on his desk, documents I'd only found after reading his letter. Your father didn't just start one foundation in your mother's memory, I said, spreading the papers across the dining room table. He started 3. The Alzheimer's Foundation was just the beginning. The first set of documents showed the establishment of the Piper Hartwell Scholarship Fund for students studying social work, a reflection of Piper's passion for helping troubled kids find their way. The second revealed the Caleb and Zoe Hartwell Foundation for Young Entrepreneurs, designed to provide startup funding for recent college graduates with innovative business ideas but limited resources. He was watching, I said as they stared at the papers in amazement. All these years, even when you thought he was distracted by grief or by his new marriage, he was paying attention to who you were becoming, what you cared about, what you dreamed of doing with your lives. But why didn't he tell us?
Caleb asked.
Because he wanted to make sure the foundations would still exist even if something happened to him, I said. They're all fully funded and legally established. You can choose to be involved with them or not, but they'll continue doing good work either way. Zoe picked up one of the documents, her eyes scanning the legal language. This says the Alzheimer's Foundation already has enough funding to break ground on the care facility next spring. And the scholarship fund has enough money to send 12 kids to college every year for the next 20 years, Piper added, her voice filled with wonder. Dad really did think of everything, Caleb said. Even after death, he's still taking care of people. That's not all, I said, pulling out the final folder. He also left detailed plans for what he wanted to happen to this house. Their faces tensed again, and I realized they were bracing for another shock. "Relax," I said, smiling. He wanted it to remain the family home, but he also wanted it to serve a purpose. The third floor has been redesigned as guest suites for families dealing with Alzheimer's, people who need a place to stay while their loved ones are in treatment, or who need respite care themselves. I spread out the architectural drawings Richard had commissioned, showing how the old servants' quarters could be converted into comfortable temporary housing while maintaining the home's character and the family's privacy. He thought of it as a way to honor your mother's memory while keeping the house alive and useful, I said. Families helping families. But it would only work if we all lived here together, if this place felt like a real home instead of a museum. The three of them exchanged glances, and I could see them processing not just the practical implications, but the emotional ones. Their father had essentially asked them to open their childhood home to strangers, to make their private grief a public mission of healing. "What do you think?" I asked. "Are you ready to turn your family home into a place where other families can find hope?" "I think," Piper said slowly, "that Mom would love the idea of her house being full of people again. She always said this place was too big for just one family." "And I think," Caleb added, "that Dad found a way to make sure we'd have to work together, whether we wanted to or not. Pretty clever, actually." Zoe laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her since Richard's funeral. He was always manipulative in the most loving way possible. Remember how he used to set up coincidental meetings when we were fighting with each other? Like the time he sent us both to pick up his dry cleaning at the same time and then pretended his car wouldn't start, so we had to ride home together, Caleb said, grinning at the memory. Or when he booked that family vacation to the cabin with only one bedroom and claimed it was a reservation mistake, Piper added. Listening to them share memories of their father's gentle matchmaking, I felt something I hadn't experienced since his death, a sense of belonging, of being part of their history rather than separate from it. "He did the same thing with us," I said. "The night he proposed, he told me he'd been plotting ways to get me to fall in love with his children for months. He said he couldn't marry someone who didn't love his kids as much as he did." "Did it work?" Zoe asked. "What do you think?" I said, looking around the table at their faces. "I spent 6 years trying to win your approval. I learned to make Caleb's favorite chocolate chip cookies from scratch. I never missed one of Piper's school plays, even when you pretended not to want me there. I kept all of Zoe's artwork from high school in a special box in my closet because I was afraid to display it without permission but couldn't bear to throw it away." "You kept my art?" Zoe asked, her eyes widening. "I kept everything. Every report card, every award, every newspaper clipping about your achievements. I have a whole file cabinet full of Hartwell children memorabilia because I wanted to be able to prove that I'd been paying attention, that I cared about your lives even when you didn't want me to." "That's either really sweet or really creepy," Caleb said, but he was smiling. "Probably both," I admitted. "But that's what love looks like sometimes. Messy and overwhelming and slightly inappropriate. Like falling for a married man whose wife is dying," Zoe said, but there was no accusation in her voice anymore. "Exactly like that," I said. "Love doesn't follow the rules we think it should. It just shows up and demands that we figure out how to honor it without destroying everything else we care about." The conversation drifted then, moving from heavy revelations to lighter memories, from grief to gratitude, from accusation to acceptance. We talked until nearly midnight, and when we finally said goodnight, it felt like we were saying goodnight as a family for the first time. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of the room I'd shared with Richard, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still missing something important. There had been too many secrets, too many carefully orchestrated revelations, too many coincidences. Richard had been many things, but subtle wasn't one of them. If he'd gone to this much trouble to orchestrate our reconciliation, if he'd planned every detail of this emotional journey, what was the final destination he'd had in mind? The answer came to me at 3 a.m. when I got up to get a glass of water and noticed light coming from under the door of Richard's study. I found Caleb sitting at his father's desk, reading through the business files I'd given him earlier. "Can't sleep either?" I asked. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and emotion. I keep thinking about what Dad said in that letter, about trusting your discretion with our inheritance. I thought it was about money, but it wasn't, was it? I shook my head. It was about trust. About whether you'd be willing to believe that someone could love your father without trying to replace your mother, and whether I'd be willing to love you even when you made it incredibly difficult. And the house, the foundations, the business, all of that was just the vehicle for the real test. Which was? Caleb leaned back in the leather chair that had been his father's favorite spot for thinking through difficult problems. Whether we could become a real family instead of just people who shared DNA and tragedy. And what's the verdict? I asked. I think, he said slowly, that Dad would be proud of how tonight went. But I also think he had one more surprise plan that we haven't figured out yet. He pulled out a business card I recognized, Dr. Sarah Chun, family therapist, the woman who'd helped Richard and me navigate the early challenges of blending our lives. This was in Dad's desk calendar, Caleb said. An appointment scheduled for next week. For all four of us. I stared at the card, remembering how Dr. Chun had helped Richard and me work through his guilt about falling in love again and my insecurity about stepping into Catherine's shadow. She'd been the one to suggest that love wasn't about replacing what was lost, but about building something new from what remained. He made an appointment for family therapy, I said. Even after death, he's still trying to fix things. Should we go?
Caleb asked.
I thought about Richard's final letter, about his confession that he'd been too much of a coward to tell his children the truth while he was alive, about his faith that I'd have the courage to finish what he'd started. Yes, I said. We should go. But not because your father scheduled it. Because we want to. Do we want to? I looked at this young man who'd spent 6 years seeing me as the enemy, who'd finally begun to see me as family, who was now asking me to help him navigate the complicated landscape of blended families and inherited grief. I do, I said. The question is whether you're ready to do the hard work of becoming siblings with someone who didn't grow up in your house. He smiled, and for a moment, he looked exactly like Richard. I think I'm ready to try. But I have one condition. What's that? No more secrets. If we're going to be a family, we need to know everything about each other. The good, the bad, and the embarrassingly messy. I laughed, thinking about the stories I could tell about his father's quirks, about my own failed first marriage, about the complicated dance of grief and healing we'd all been learning together. Deal, I said. But you might regret that request once you hear about the time your father tried to surprise me with a home-cooked dinner and nearly burned down the kitchen. I want to hear all of it, Caleb said. Every embarrassing story, every private moment, every reason you fell in love with our dad. Because those stories belong to all of us now. As I headed back to bed, I realized that Richard's final gift wasn't just the truth about the past. It was permission to build a future together, messily and imperfectly, and with all the complicated love that Real families carry. But the biggest surprise was still waiting for us. The next morning, as we sat around the breakfast table planning our first family meeting about the foundations and the house renovations, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see a woman about my age standing on the porch, holding a manila envelope and looking nervous. Are you expecting someone? Piper asked. I shook my head, but something about the woman's posture, the way she held herself, looked familiar. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with someone I recognized from family photos but had never met in person. You must be Vivian, she said, extending her hand. I'm Rebecca, Catherine's sister. The woman Richard's children had never mentioned, the sister I'd assumed didn't exist because she was never part of family gatherings or holiday celebrations. But here she was, standing on our doorstep with an envelope that looked remarkably similar to the ones Richard had left for me. Catherine asked me to give this to you, Rebecca said, but only after Richard was gone, and only if it looked like the family was finally healing. I've been waiting for the right moment. Behind me, I heard the scrape of chairs as Caleb, Zoe, and Piper came to see who was at the door. Their gasps told me they recognized their aunt, the woman who'd disappeared from their lives shortly after their mother's diagnosis. Aunt Rebecca? Piper whispered. Hello, sweetheart. Rebecca said, tears already streaming down her face. I know you probably don't understand why I stayed away, but I hope this letter will explain everything. She handed me the envelope, and I saw Catherine's handwriting on the outside. For my family, when they're ready to understand why I asked Rebecca to let them grieve me first. As I stood there holding what appeared to be Catherine's final secret, I realized that Richard's carefully orchestrated plan had one more act, one more revelation that would either complete our healing or shatter the fragile trust we'd only just begun to build. Would you like to come in? I asked Rebecca, stepping aside to let Catherine's sister enter the house she'd once known as well as her own. I'd like that very much, she said. I have so many stories to tell you about your mother, and I think it's finally time you heard them. As Rebecca crossed the threshold into the Hartwell family home, I caught sight of her car in the driveway and noticed the back seat, filled with boxes and suitcases. She wasn't just here for a visit. She was coming home. And suddenly, Richard's plan became crystal clear. He hadn't just wanted to heal the relationship between his children and me. He'd wanted to restore the extended family that Catherine's illness had torn apart, to give his children back the aunt who'd loved them first, to give me an ally who understood both the woman I'd followed and the children we both wanted to protect. But as Rebecca walked into the living room and saw the family photos that lined the mantelpiece, including several of Catherine during her final year that showed the telltale signs of her illness to anyone who knew what to look for, her face crumpled with a grief so raw it was clear she'd been carrying it alone for years. I should have been here, she said, sinking into Catherine's favorite chair. I should have helped her through it instead of running away, because I couldn't bear to watch her disappear. And just like that, I realized that Richard's final lesson wasn't about secrets or inheritance or even love. It was about forgiveness. Catherine's letter, still unopened in my hands, contained the key to understanding why some people stay and fight when someone they love is dying, and why others run away because the pain is too great to witness. Both choices came from love. Both choices left scars. And both choices deserved compassion. Would you like to read this together? I asked Rebecca, holding up the letter. As a family? She looked around at Caleb, Zoe, and Piper, at the children she'd helped raise until fear drove her away, and nodded. I think Catherine would like that, she said. She always said family was about showing up, especially when showing up was hard. As we gathered around the dining room table where we'd shared so many revelations the night before, I realized that Richard's story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. We were about to discover not just what Catherine had wanted us to know, but what she'd hoped we'd become, a family that could hold space for all kinds of love, all kinds of grief, all kinds of second chances. But first, we had to open one more envelope and face one more truth about the complicated, beautiful, heartbreaking way that families find their way back to each other. The letter in my hands felt warm, as if Catherine's love was still alive inside it, waiting to bridge the final gap between past and present, between the family that had been and the family we were about to become. And somewhere I was certain Richard was smiling.